right. Welcome, everybody. Thursday afternoon. Now, let's see here. And from the beginning. Okay, Kathy, am I in presentation mode?
It looks good.
It looks good. All right. So I want to welcome everybody. This is our third event of the 4 Chiefs. So 3 out of 4, we have one more coming up. I'm Sally Snyder. I am the coordinator of diversity programming, and my pronouns are she, her. Before getting underway, I always like to share our mission with you, which is to enrich, support, and celebrate our diverse community by acting as a catalyst for inclusion, continuous learning, understanding, and acceptance through active engagement and facilitation of educational opportunities that challenge biases and deepen conversations. And I also like to give some credit to Camille Ireland, a graduate of RCC, for designing this lovely graphic element for us for the Diversity Programming Board. So the other events that we have coming up, we've already done fire and water. Today is land, and then May 27th will be air. Okay, so I want to see everybody's faces here. And bear with me as I swap some screens. Okay, so let's see. Well, now I'm going to go ahead and introduce our guest speakers, resident guests. Yes, David West, right here with me, is an enrolled member and elder of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, and he's the Director Emeritus of Native American Programs at Southern Oregon University, currently retired, though ever active. Yes. He has been a member of the Oregon Indian Education Association for 35 years, and he's also a member of the National Congress of American Indians. He has been selected as the Indian Educator of the Year and as the Elder of the Year in a different year by the same organization. In 2001, a beloved dean of Rogue Community College, Tennyson Haley, established an award named in his honor, the David D. West 7th Generation Diversity Award, and David's the very first recipient. He's a beloved part of this community, and he's a dear friend to many. And we're always delighted to have him here with us.
Thank you.
Welcome.
My pleasure.
And we also have Dr. Kathy Kemp Papel, who is serving as RCC's 6th president since 2016. She did start her career conducting environmental research at McNeese State University, and later became a professor at Lone Star College, where she taught environmental biology and led student field experiences in Texas, Colorado, Arkansas, and Costa Rica. Along the way, Kathy became a forest landowner, practicing sustainable forestry on her 250-acre tree farm in Texas, and then on her 63-acre tract here in Oregon. So please join me in welcoming David and Kathy here today. And one more thing, I have David here who is going to read a land acknowledgement for us, especially fitting today talking about land. Thank you, David.
Thank you. Good morning. Actually, good afternoon now. In our desire for collective healing and partnership, we offer this acknowledgement of Indigenous peoples and their connections to the land that Rogue Community College occupies. This acknowledgement was developed in conversation between Grand Ronde tribal staff, Siletz tribal staff, and Native American programs faculty and staff at Southern Oregon University. It continues to be a living statement through this ongoing partnership. On behalf of Rogue Community College, I would like to take this moment to acknowledge that Rogue Community College is located within the ancestral homelands of the Shasta, Takilma, and Latgawa peoples, who have lived here since time immemorial. These tribes were displaced during rapid Euro-American colonization, the gold rush, and armed conflict between 1851 and 1856. In the 1850s, discovery of gold and settlement brought thousands of Euro-Americans to their lands, leading to warfare, epidemics, starvation, and villages being burned. In 1853, the first of several treaties were signed, confederating these tribes and others together, who would then be referred to as the Rogue River Tribe. These treaties ceded most of their homelands to the United States, and in return, they were guaranteed a permanent homeland reserved for them. At the end of the Rogue River Wars in 1856, these tribes and many other tribes from Western Oregon were removed to the Siletz Reservation and the Grand Ronde Reservation. Today, the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians are living descendants of the Takilma, Shasta, and Latgawa peoples of this area. I encourage you to learn about the land you reside on and to join us in advocating for the inherent sovereignty of Indigenous peoples. Thank you.
Okay, and now I'm going to give the floor to you and Kathy. And if you want to check your phone, I heard it's being insistent.
Yes, excuse me. I have some family circumstances that I'm having to keep track of while we're online today. So please excuse me if I have to step off for just a moment. We'll be right back. Kathy, maybe you could start out for us if you wouldn't mind.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So one of the things that I in listening to our introductions that I wanted to focus on for just a moment is that I doubt that you would very often hear an Indigenous person reference the size of their land. That I think is a very white person perspective, and in delineating the exact size of their property, and I'm sure you're all aware of the fact that property wasn't carved up into fenced compartments until the colonization of this country by immigrants who came from a place where that was their tradition, was to have fences and strictly delineate whose land was whose. So I always think to myself that and I haven't made any attempt to edit that introduction because I think it actually does highlight a real difference in perspective between our cultures, and one that we should recognize because it does play an integral part in how we treat the land.
Most of the tribes, I couldn't agree more. Most of the tribes that I've studied or have looked at this issue about always said the place where we hunt and fish and gather our foods and our medicines. And those were usually territories that were oftentimes fiercely defended, but also were there to be neighbors that were in a time of need that they were allowed access or granted access. There were also numerous areas that were considered to be communal lands, lands that no one really owned or laid claim to or had oversight of. Most of the tribes in North America, in their creation stories, they have, in nearly all of them, they have instructions upon their creation that they were being created in order to be caretakers and stewards to the land. And that would ensure their living because they would take care of their food, their water, their medicines, and those things that came from the land. For example, the island of Manhattan, New York City, was a place, Manhattan was what it was called. And it was a common use area and considered to be sacred ground because of the high volume of food that was there. It was a very, very productive area and was full of all kinds of fish in the rivers, the streams. There were deer and elk and even buffalo, woodlands buffalo were there, and all manner of waterfowl. And so eggs and birds and food was everywhere. And it was a very productive area. And the Indian people there just could not wrap their head around the concept of the fact that somebody thought they had bought that land from them and it was theirs now. There was not even any concept of that way of thinking that they could look to for understanding. And there's, for my people of the Great Lakes, I'm Potawatomi, Miami, and Kickapoo. And for the Great Lakes people, our language and has some very long words. And there is one word that has 36 syllables in it.
Can you
And
say
that,
it?
no, that one word translates to mean you fish on your side, we fish on our side, nobody fishes in the middle. The wisdom that was beyond that translation was that there had to be a place for the fish to go where they could be safe from the fishermen and that they could have the time for their reproduction, for their feeding, for their rest. And that one word said everything about the relationship of the two neighboring tribes that utilized the same resource. And it kind of says everything about, gee, I wish we could do that today. If you had a neighbor that was taking too much coal out of the ground, maybe you could go and say, maybe we could share some of that, or some other kind of way that would preclude that sense of ownership. And because sense of ownership oftentimes becomes problematic.
Agreed. I'm sure there are probably few words in indigenous languages that have to do with fences and property lines and terminology that that settlers introduced into this land. So when we were talking about preparing for this, David, we had a couple of questions we asked each other. You know, the first was, do you love the land? Which
Yes.
Unequivocally, we both said yes.
Yes.
And then the second question was, does the land love you back?
Yes. For me, it does.
Tell me thoughts on that.
When I go to the woods, I try to be as quiet as I can because that's someone's home there. We're taught when we dance, at least it's been my experience, and I've been a dancer and an arena director for many, many years, in charge of the dance floor. And our teaching is that each step in that dance arena is like a prayer. And that many of the dancers, you'll see them look back behind them to the right or the left and look down at the ground behind them. And that's to take into account, as we're dancing our prayer, what life are we stepping on there? From the smallest of the creepy crawlers to those that live just underneath the earth, the roly-poly bugs, the worms, the ants, all of the little beings that live on the ground. And here comes this gigantic foot down, even though it's dancing, and squash, that's the end of that life that's contained in that footstep. My dad taught me similar kinds of things about hunting. You be quiet because you're in somebody else's house and you don't want to spook that game. That's why many Indian men find it hard to ask for help, because they didn't hunt like that. They hunted in teams and partners, hunting partners, and young people that had grown up together, and they practiced being able to communicate without talking. And that could be through signs, that could be through intuition, that could be through the force of the mind. And so that you didn't want to holler out, hey, Two Feathers, there's a big elk right over here, because that big elk is going to be gone way ahead of Two Feathers and whoever else. You didn't holler like that. But there was also the concept of that you didn't have to ask for help. Your hunting partner would see that that elk or that moose was down in the water. Moose will sink in the water of a pond, and then you've lost 1,800 pounds of meat. You didn't tie the moose to the bank and then run over and ask your cousin, hey, come and help me drag this moose out of the pond. because the cousin already knew I go and help pull that moose out of the pond. It's going to feed both of our families. Same way next week, the other cousin might catch a 60-pound salmon, and he's not going to be able to hang on to that salmon and run over and ask for his cousin to come help him pull that salmon out of the river. And they know that was there. That was reciprocity, and the land would thank them in keeping their luck in relationship to how they treated that game. When they cleaned that fish, they returned the bones and the intestinals to the river. So it was a way of paying respect, and the belief was that the fish would regenerate themselves. The same for the land animals. When the game was taken, they would put whatever food that game animal ate in its mouth and make a prayer to the spirit of that one that they had just taken, and leave some for the ravens, leave some for the wolves, leave some for the little birds, leave some for the vultures, leave some for the little bugs that come to clean up the earth. Reciprocity, again, and inclusion. And the animals then looked upon the human beings with favor, and you would keep your luck. If you lost your luck, you starved because you didn't have the proper relationship to the animals. You hadn't paid them the proper respect. So that comes back to us. Also, one of the things that we're always told to do is to deal with the disconnect between ourselves and the land. When you go out to the forest, when you go out to the prairie, to the ocean, to the lake, turn your cell phone off, leave it in the car, take your watch off. Those things that will interfere with your thought energy, your spiritual energy, and you make a connection back to the land. And if you speak to the earth and tell her that you love her, and exhibit that love by cleaning up the trash, making sure that it's a good, clean place that you left wherever you go in better shape than when you found it, when you came there. That one day you might be standing looking into the forest, and you could possibly hear a voice coming from the forest saying back to you, thank you for being a good caretaker and a thoughtful person. I feel that way on my property when I clean it up, when I do something good there, when I take out the invasive species, when I reduce the fuels, fire fuels. I know that the forest is watching. The forest has eyes. And I'm a longtime believer in that plants are sentient beings, as is everything that has life. They have a thought process, they have a mind, and many of them are much more intelligent than we are in many aspects. So again, it's that communication. Kathy, what you give out is often what you get back.
I couldn't agree with you more. I too, as a forest landowner, spend a lot of time on the weekends out doing forest fuels reduction and removal of invasive species. And to me, that is such a peaceful time. It's hard work. It's great exercise. Who needs a gym? It's fresh air, and it's interacting with lots of different organisms. And yeah, you just feel, so I personally feel so connected to nature when I'm out working like that. And, you know, when I was teaching, I wanted to share that feeling with my students. Most of them lived, you know, in town. Most of them lived in apartment complexes and didn't even have yards. And part of our class was a 10-day field experience to one of those destinations that Sally listed. And the first rule was you couldn't bring anything electronic with you. And we made students actually dump their bags out before we left to filter out things, because we were camping the entire time. We had no electricity, so there was no point in bringing anything electronic. You weren't going to recharge it anyway. So we left all of that behind, and it was so fascinating to see how the first 3 days were really exciting, and everybody was having a great time. But on day 3, things started to deteriorate. And by the end of day 3, there was always, out of every single one of these trips, there was always a meltdown on day 3. And what we learned over the years doing those trips was that 3 days is about as long as somebody can go being really uncomfortable and doing without things that they're used to having. And whether it's technology or their soft mattress or the ability to watch TV or whatever, 3 days was the max. And so at the end of that 3rd day, we would cook dinner around a campfire, and we would spend several hours processing, what's happening. Why is everybody short-tempered and sometimes getting into physical fights? What's happening here? And ultimately, the students would come to realize that it was their discomfort with our living circumstances. And, this was a weekend camping trip, sounded great, but this was 10 days. And the weekend was over, and they still had 7 days to go. But at the end, every student talked about what a remarkable connection they had made to nature, spiritual connections that they discovered that they didn't know they had. Students, the very last night, we would take students out and in the dark and park them on a rock with a flashlight and a pen and a pad and spread them out so they couldn't talk to each other, and ask them to just write, whatever was on their mind. They wrote songs, they wrote poetry, they drew beautiful pictures. Some didn't write anything at all. Some just sat and meditated. But without exception, every student said that, that final quiet time, sitting under, a star-filled sky, really brought home to them that they were not as important as they thought they were, that they were just a small thread in a very large fabric of life, and that they really needed to understand their place in nature, and that it wasn't as the supreme ruler of nature, but as an integral part of it. For me, that was like every teacher, when you see that light bulb go off, that was the reward, was seeing students understand their place in the world and their relationship to nature. That was the whole point. It was a very rewarding experience, and one I encourage everyone to do and embrace.
Yes, I couldn't agree more myself with that either. And we experienced a similar kind of thing the year after Grizzly Peak in Ashland burned the top of the mountain and over the top and down about a quarter of the way from the top down towards the Indian Memorial Road. When that burned, it burned the whole top of Grizzly Peak. And we've known for some time the archaeologists and anthropologists for both of all three of the tribes actually four of the tribes that utilized the Ashland area, the Klamath, the Takelma, of course, the people that are now at Siletz, and the folks that are at Grand Ronde, and the Shasta people of Northern California, and so also some of the Karuk people used that area as a vision questing site. And we've known for many years that there were upwards of 275 to 300 vision quest sites on Grizzly Peak that you access by going towards Shale City off of Indian Memorial Road. And there's a big sign that says Grizzly Peak Trail and a beautiful parking lot there. And we would take our Native American Youth Academy at Southern Oregon University, and there would be upwards of 50 of us. And we would hike to the top of Grizzly Peak as an outdoor experience on the second day of the academy before we started our classroom experiences on Monday. On Sunday, we would hike Grizzly Peak. This particular year was just after the fire, and we decided that we would carry our big drum, our big powwow drum, up the mountain. And my colleague, Brent Florindo, carried it the entire way. And when we got up to the top, he had us travel in the old style of the people in moving from place to place. And so there were runners that were out ahead of the main body, runners that were just real close to the main body. There were people on each side of the trail, and then there were some that were in the back of the group. The fast people were the ones that were the forward people out in front of everybody. The athletes, the super ones that could roar up there way faster than grandpa and auntie and grandma, even some of the other young people. So we had them with their boundless energy go back to the back of the pack and make sure that those that were coming up in the last part of it were making it okay, and to stay with them if they needed help, or to escort them back down to the vehicles if they just couldn't make it, so that we didn't leave anyone behind, leave no one behind. When we got to the top, the trail forks, and one way goes to the left, one way goes to the right. The one that went to the right hadn't been used in some years to any extent because of the heavy brush that had grown up into the trail. But since the fire came, we decided that we would go around that way. And we did, and we observed at least 25, if not more, additional Vision Quest sites that we had never seen before. When we got to the top, Brent had everybody stop, and one student at a time was to go out and pick what they thought was a Vision Quest site, and just to sit down in that Vision Quest site, because there's usually a pit area there. If they felt uncomfortable about sitting down in the middle of it, they could sit on the side of it next to it, so that they weren't infringing on any energies that might be there. They were to sit there and wait until everybody had found their place, and they were to think about what was their educational vision. What did they want to do with an education? And how to vision that for not only for themselves, but for their people, for their land, and for the Mother Earth. There was an appropriate period of time. This took about 2 hours for everybody to get in their spot and to have a period of time for them to contemplate and reflect on their vision of what they wanted to do with their education. These are 7th through 12th graders. And we older folks went and picked a spot and thought about, what do we want to do with the rest of our lives? What's our life vision? We're in our educational vision. What was our life vision? What did we want to do for the rest of it? We gathered all of those stories. It was time to go back down the mountain. So we went back down the mountain after we sang, and we looked at some of these beautiful places that people had chosen to seek for their visions, which is usually 4 days long. So that fourth day, concept really came into play there as well. When we got down, we decided that we would have a sunrise ceremony on Monday morning to greet the sun and to start our week out in a very old and traditional way. And so we went out early before the sunrise and we sat outside and we started talking about what people's educational vision had come, what things had come to them in thinking about that. They didn't have to reveal anything they were uncomfortable with revealing, but the things that they did share were absolutely incredible. And it guided us in later years to the kinds of courses that we wanted to offer that addressed some of those educational vision of our Native students, whether that's from being the best snowmobile mechanic, boat engine mechanic, logger, whatever it was. How did you do it in a good way? Professor, police officer, anything. What do you want to do and how are you going to do it? So that you honor those ancient teachings, but still have your life to live in contemporary society. And it was a beautiful experience. And what we discovered by going out that early and being on the south end of Ashland of the university, the lights of the city were behind us. And the sky was beautiful, starlit morning, beautiful morning for the sunrise to come. And we discovered that some of the students that were from Salem and Portland that lived in the downtown areas of Salem and Portland had never seen the stars. These are at least 7th graders, had never seen the stars. Native youth had never seen the stars. It really surprised us. We were taken quite back by that. And that became one of our slogans about look to the stars, see the stars. We didn't allow anybody to have any phones out there, no electronics of any kind, same as you folks did, Kathy. It was an amazing experience. And in talking to students that were there that year, now in these later years, this was quite a long time ago, their educational visions for many of them have come true, or they're in the process of them coming true for them. So we realized what a very important and integral piece this really had been.
You know that one of my favorite books is Last Child in the Woods, which is really a book about the sociological impact of nature on the growth and development of children, and the fact that there is scientific evidence that clearly shows that a child who is isolated from nature does not develop the way that they should, and they tend to display more aggressive behaviors and so forth. And so it always comes back to me when I'm feeling bad, when I see someone else feeling bad. It's let's go for a walk in the woods. Let's get outdoors. Let's leave our phone behind us and listen to the sounds of nature. Because there are so many people who, if you ask them, do you know the difference between the wind in oak trees and the wind in Douglas firs, that they absolutely would have no idea that those two things sound completely different.
Yes.
Or that different forests smell differently. Different soils smell differently and feel differently. We're raising generations of children who have no idea where food comes from. It's the grocery store. They just don't have a clue that plants generate food. It doesn't magically appear in the grocery store. I've been in junior high level classrooms where kids had no idea where food came from. And that's as astonishing to me as never having seen stars. Those are obvious indications of a disconnect with nature.
Mhm.
And as long as we're disconnected to nature, how can we love it? And how can we know that it can love us back if we're not connected?
Exactly. We had a wonderful elder lady here in the community. Her name was Black Star, many years ago. And she was very, very active with the Indian education programs in Southern Oregon, and many times took young people on trips to the Warm Springs Reservation. She was very close friends with some of the folks from the Symnasho Longhouse at Warm Springs. And when we would go, there was a place up by Diamond Lake that we would pull off the road and go back in to the trees, and it was on an elevated spot where you could see a long ways. And she would have everybody get out and tell them, go to a place where you can see out quite a long distance. And I want you to do something that will help you to realize that you have a place on earth, that you do belong. Because in those years, this is like 30 years ago, in those times, a lot of our young people didn't feel like they were connected. They didn't come from the reservation. They lived in an urban area, sometimes in the country, but not in a native-based community. And so they didn't feel like they belonged in the native world or in the Indian world. Those things still occur, but to a less degree. We're thankful to see these days. But back in those days, it was a very common problem and an issue that we tried to deal with. And she came up with a great one. She told us, you go out and find a tree, just one tree, one of the one-leggeds. Go out and find a tree that you feel comfortable with, and you back up to it and put your back up against it and reach behind you and grab that tree and hang on to it. And then to start over your left shoulder and look as far back as you could over your left shoulder until you were looking as close as you could get to the center of your back and behind you. And then to very, very slowly, just like the way of the sun, follow to the right and turn your head and look at all of the life out there until you came to the center place behind your right shoulder. You'd looked all the way around, you completed a circle in your visioning. And when you were looking at that, you were to think about all of the life that you could see out there. All of the flyers, the swimmers, the crawlers, the two-legged, the one-legged, the plants and food, Mother Earth, all of the beings that live out there, all those that live on the ground, all those that live under the ground, all those that live above the ground, the same with the water. And she said, you're going to get about a quarter of the way to halfway around there, and you're going to begin to feel kind of small when you're looking at all of that life represented out there. But she said, when you start to feel like that and you've completed your full circle, she said, you stop and think about that full circle of that tree that's right behind you that you're leaning against and that you're hanging on to. That's one of the family of the one-leggeds. It lives its entire life in that one spot. And it sees this that you're looking at every day in some manner of speaking. It can't move from its place, but it most definitely has its place on the earth. And she said, and then look down at your feet and realize that you're one of the two-leggeds. You're gifted to be able to travel from place to place. You are able to go and look at all different kinds and parts of the earth and all of the beings that live there, so that each place that you go like that, you think about all of the life that lives there, and you become open to attuning to that place. And place is important to people. And she said, then you begin to not feel so insignificant, and you realize that you too have your place upon the earth and have that gifted ability for you to travel from that place to place. Incredible responses from our young people, and even from those of us that were young adults at that time. Really quite an amazing exercise. And I encourage anybody to give it a try and see what it does for you.
I love that. One of my favorite things to do is to lie on the ground and look up in a forest and just lie there and observe everything that I can see that's happening in that forest. And it's amazing how much is happening. And you really get a sense of that tree that's rooted there, all the life that's interacting with that tree all day, every day. It's really very humbling to think about the magnitude of experience that can happen in a single place, day after day after day. I want.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that we've talked about forests a lot. One of the things that deeply concerns me is the lack of value of certain kinds of ecosystems. I think we I'm saying we as in white people, have a tendency to value land based on the type of productivity we want it to have, and not the productivity that is natural to that land. And so, I think about the diversity of ecosystems that there are across this planet, and how those ecosystems, there are not fences between those ecosystems. They blend seamlessly into each other, and they do things to support each other. And so it is a patchwork, sort of, but it's a patchwork with very blurred lines, and a great deal of reciprocity between neighboring ecosystems. There are a great many animals that depend on multiple ecosystems for their existence. They have to move between them in order to get everything they need. But we humans have a tendency to only value the ecosystems that produce lots of wood for lumber, or the grasses can be replaced with rows of crops. And we don't value swamps. David, you talked earlier about aquatic ecosystems that are so productive, like around Manhattan. We have not valued our estuaries. And estuaries are probably the single most productive places on the planet, because they are where fresh and saltwater meet. They are where land and water meet, and they are the nursery grounds for millions of species. And yet, if you can't build on them, they're not valuable. So let's drain them so we can build stuff on them. And if you look at our coastlines in this country, there's been a great deal of draining of estuaries in order to build on those coastlines, and a lack of value for the life that was there. It concerns me that we don't value diversity in all of its forms. We save what we want to save rather than try to save all ecosystems. I just wonder if there's an indigenous philosophy there that you would want to share, David.
Well, there probably is, and I think it's kind of wrapped up in. When I was a kid, I lived on Griffin Creek in the Medford area. That's where I grew up, and Griffin Creek ran right down through the middle of our little small pasture and our neighbor's pasture. And there was enough water on it to be able to trap muskrats. And So let's see, I think that was fall time, that we were trapping muskrats, and all of a sudden the water got really muddy and we couldn't figure out where that was coming. So my friend and I, my neighbor, we backtracked that stream and found where they were digging it up to make a housing complex, an apartment complex. And that stuck with me so much because they dirtied up the water so bad the muskrats left. And then pretty soon they had drained the water off and diverted it, that we didn't have that little creek running down through the back of our property, the little estuaries and stuff, little swamplands, the boggy areas, we used to call them, were gone. And so now I drive by all of the new subdivision houses in Central Point, right by the high school there. And that's some of the richest soil in Southern Oregon. When they were first turning that dirt over, it was just black and beautiful, beautiful, loamy soil there. And now, where would you plant anything? We've watched the fruit trees, the pear trees, the peaches diminish to where now we have marijuana grows and vineyards. Very tough to eat either one of those to get anything like you would get from pears and apples and peaches. Where's our food going to get grown when we've destroyed the estuaries, the waterways, the wetlands, and built huge tract complexes of apartments? I just have never understood that. Why plant on the best farmland, or why build on the best farmlands? It doesn't make sense to me. I can't find a balance with that. If you destroy the estuaries, you end up in big trouble. I think I spoke about during the water segment about the people in Alaska having the state fisheries biologists come to their village and tell them that they wanted to talk about the issues of the salmon population, the shortage of the salmon in the rivers, and what to do about it. And the elders of the community said, well, first of all, we need to talk about the beavers. And the state biologist said, we're not the beaver people, we're the salmon people. We came here to talk about the salmon. We know about salmon, we don't know much about the beaver. And it's reported that the elder chief of the village said, and therein lies the problem. You don't consider anybody else but one, and one only. You're only thinking about the fish. The reason that we want to talk to you about the beavers is because all of the estuaries are being drained, or they're getting polluted. And that's where the salmon spawn. And the beavers keep that water moving and keep it fresh by their dams and by having clean channels that they drag their food, their aspen and willow and all of those trees that they carry to their food caches. It takes the weeds out, the grasses, and it makes a channel, and it's very fine gravel. Exactly the kind of nursery that salmon need. They said, now all of that pollution, that big wavy long grass looks like a moss that's in those beaver ponds and those estuaries, that a lot of them were created by beavers. They filter out all of the beaver scat so you don't end up with giardia. And now every headwater, every stream in the West, almost everyone has giardia. And when I asked the state biologist here, does that have anything to do with the shortage of beaver? And she said, exactly. She said, how did you know that? And I said, I listened to those old people in Alaska who'd been watching this in their estuaries and in the Minto Flats, 375 square miles of estuaries on the Tanana River for centuries, from time out of mind. And they knew how to take care of it. So that became a selling point as a career counselor about who has the greatest knowledge or depth of feeling about that kind of a particular place. Maybe they should be the state biologists, the fish and game people, taking care of those places where their people have lived from time out of mind, because they have ancient memory of the use of that place and the balance that's required of that place to continue to produce and sustain life.
That's an awesome example. Absolutely perfect example. You know, there's so much reciprocity in these ecosystems between the various inhabitants, and when you remove one, you set it in imbalance. You know, we biologists, especially in environmental biology and botany, talk about secondary succession, and how when you disturb a forest, you know, if you cut, if a tree falls and a light gap forms, you know, other trees will grow up in that space. And yeah, even if you log a forest and clear cut it, over time other stuff will come back in, but it takes centuries for that to happen. And I think that unwittingly, ecologists have given people the notion that the earth can heal itself. It doesn't really matter what we humans do to it. The earth has the capacity to heal itself. I mean, and that's true to some extent. It's kind of like, you know, how deep of a cut can you make in your arm before it can't heal itself anymore? You know, how big a gash can you make in an ecosystem before that ecosystem can't heal itself any longer? And we have tons of examples of that around here. We have had wildfires that were so intense that they destroyed the microbes in the soil, and now things aren't growing in that soil. You know, we have had, you know, one of the last stops in my Colorado trip with my students was to a place called Rocky Mountain Arsenal. After spending, you know, 9 days camping in, you know, this beautiful wilderness, we spent our last day stopping to observe what happens to wilderness when it's turned into a dump, a toxic waste dump, and can it actually recover? And if you're not familiar with Rocky Mountain Arsenal, it's just east of Denver, and it is still owned by the U.S. government, and it was a place where chemical weapons were made. And then when in the 60s, when the U.S. government stopped making chemical weapons there, they leased the land to Shell Oil, who made all kinds of toxic chemicals there, like chlordane. What they did there was dig holding ponds to put residual chemicals that were not, they couldn't sell them. And so they would pour them into these man-made ponds and just let them sit there. And Rocky Mountain Arsenal for quite some time was well known as containing the most toxic square mile in North America. I think there may be some other places that have topped that now, but what was interesting was scientists were asked to solve the issue of what to do with all of this waste. And they came up, after several years of research, came up with the best method to get rid of this waste was to build a very high temperature incinerator and incinerate the water and the soil lining the ponds, and every piece of equipment, every building, everything that was still left on that property had to be incinerated. And they calculated that if they incinerated everything, the residue would be at of chemical waste would be at about 0.02%. The people of Denver thought that that was unacceptable and voted to prevent the incinerators from being built, and instead pushed for a concrete cap to be poured over these areas. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, it just seems obvious that you're not really dealing with the problem. You're just covering the problem up. But politically, that's who won out. And so these the ponds were drained. The chemicals were all basically spread in one area, and a big concrete cap was poured over it. Less than 5 years later, those toxic chemicals started showing up in Denver's water supply. Big surprise. Now, what they have done is around the perimeter of the Rocky Mountain Arsenal, they have built very expensive pumping stations that catch the groundwater and pump it back inside the arsenal to keep it from leaching out and getting into Denver's water supply. This is a major ongoing expense that will never end in order to protect that water supply. And it's just an example of really bizarre thinking in terms of creating the mess to start with, and then deciding how to deal with the mess once it was made. If you ever go there, you can go inside the arsenal. It has a 25-foot fence with barbed wire around it, and the U.S. government will put you on a bus and take you on a ride through the arsenal. And what they will tell you is, look at all the lush grasses, look at all the beautiful trees, look at all the elk and deer, and this place is full of wildlife. It's full of eagles. There are tons of eagles nesting there. And they will tell you this ecosystem has restored itself. What they don't tell you is the level of toxic chemicals in the tissues of those plants and animals. And they don't address at all the fact that those eagles don't just stay inside the arsenal. They move. The elk and deer do because of the fence, but the birds are flying in and out of that arsenal constantly and moving that toxic substances in from their bodies outside of the arsenal. So it's, to me, it's an example of human folly and a major disconnect with our environment. And there are Superfund sites like that all over our country, and I suspect all over the world. We have to stop doing that. We have to stop doing that.
Yes, we do. That's why we're so adamant about zinc mining being highly regulated and controlled. Zinc mining, no zinc mine anywhere in the world has been able to build any kind of a containment pond or settling pond that will hold the effluent that is produced in the mining process of zinc. It's extremely poisonous in its raw form, and there's a real disconnect in, well, what happens after? Oh, we'll put it back like it was. I don't believe that can happen with big industrial, huge excavations of minerals from the earth. For example, the area of the Great Plains. At one time, it was felt and was promoted by the World Wildlife Fund and other entities that the Great Plains of North America, where upwards of 80 million buffalo existed, 80 million buffalo existed at one time, and possibly even more than that, was one of the best maintained and cared for pastures anywhere in the world. Held and fed the main food source animal, perfectly adapted to North America, perfectly adapted to the food that it ate, the water that it drank, and with no cholesterol. Buffalo meat has no cholesterol. It's an incredibly nutritious and beneficial food. But the other part of it is the buffalo's relationship with the land. We often think about what are the humans' relationships to the land, but the animals have their own relationship to the land. And you have to look closely sometimes and think long about it to realize what that relationship is that's being conducted by those animals. For example, the buffalo, when it walks, its hooves dig into the earth straight down. When it moves, it lifts those hooves up and it makes a divot in the ground, and it pulls the dirt that they've mashed up. 1,800 pounds of animal has mashed up and leaves it in a little mound behind where they're walking. At the same time as they're eating and progressing forward, they have their droppings that are also full of seeds, some digested, some not, with the tall buffalo grass that grows as high as a buffalo's eye and taller. When they drop their droppings, bless you, twice times. And for the next 10,000 times that you sneeze, should I not be there? Those seeds drop in there, and the buffalo then step on that little mounds of dirt. Their hind feet step on that little mound of dirt, or the next buffalo behind them, and mashes that little mound of dirt back down over the top of those seeds contained in their buffalo chips. They're replanting their own food source as they travel and maintaining it at a certain level and place to place to place to place to place. The Indian people knew that, and knew that when the grass would burn off, the stems wouldn't be so tough. Buffalo grass is really tough grass, very strong in its stem. But where it was burned, the new shoots come back in and they're very tender, and they come in very plentiful. That was one of the places that they first used, or that we know of, that cool burning was used in order to manage the well-being of the plains in relationship to the health of the buffalo. And vice versa, the buffalo added by replanting. The Indian people didn't have to replant that pasture, the buffalo did it. So everybody benefited in a cyclical, circular manner.
I love the examples in Robin Kimmerer-Wall's book about harvesting wild rice and not trying to get all of it, allowing some of it to fall back in the water to reseed, so there would be some for the future, and never taking more than half.
Yes.
Those are, greed is the big issue. It drives all of these bad behaviors.
There's a prophecy that says in the time of change, which the native nations now believe that we are definitely in this time of change. How far we're into this time of change, only the Creator knows. But the time of change is that we were to recognize our place as stewards and change our relationship to the earth and not take more than we needed. It had to come about from all of the human beings, had to realize that they contributed to the illness of the earth and her being out of balance. And it goes along with it, well, she'll just heal herself up. That's true, but it takes a very, very long time. And where are all those little beings that lived in that forest supposed to go live while that's happening? There are many ways to log. I come from a logging family for all my life, and a number of generations. And there were logging practices that were extremely beneficial in taking select cuts. It seemed to work very well. And I don't have all of the answers. I don't think that anybody does. But when you start to think about, well, where does my food come from? Just like was said, where does that board come from that made my house? Where were those stones gathered for my sauna? Those lava rocks. Most people never take into consideration that the stones that they might go and get for a sweat lodge or for a sauna, lava rocks, sure, they get hot and they hold the heat, but they also will soak up what's in the groundwater. So do you go and gather your lava rocks right outside Rocky Mountain facility or Hanford on the Columbia River? Where do you go get those stones? Because if you heat them up, they release the toxic materials in gas form that may be within them. You get sick and you can die from the rock that's supposed to help heat the lodge to help with your healing in body, mind, spirit, and emotion. It's knowing and having a relationship with your environment, and where do you get the things that you need, and how do you take care of that? How do you clean it up? It doesn't make much sense when you could incinerate those chemicals and those things and try to keep as much of that effluent out of the air as you could in a short term, as opposed to the very long term of the materials leaching into the water system, the groundwater, and eventually all the way down into the water basins. And what effect does that have on the subsequent generations? Also with the buffalo and other things, what are we taking in our greed? There's an ancient prophecy that I just mentioned a bit ago, that we're in the time of change. And it was said that in the time of change, there would come a great white bear out of the north that would have great wisdom and connection for all to see. In most tribal peoples, anything that's white, any being that's white is in color, is a sacred being. That's why when the white people came, they were considered to be sacred beings until they proved themselves different. But this great white bear is to come from the north and rest and recuperate and gather its strength in itself in the west, and return from the west to the east to heal the sickness that came from the east to the west. That sickness being seen as greed. Greed is the great sickness that created all of the other sicknesses because of the destruction that it brought to all things. We're having trouble with transportation issues right now, and trucker strikes, and getting products to market, and things are being wasted because of it. How come we aren't utilizing the railroads more? There was such a tremendous drive to get those railroads in there, and they destroyed lots of things and assisted in the killing off of the buffalo. Why aren't those rail systems being utilized to move the goods that we need to have back and forth across the country? What's stopping that? You just made it and then decide you don't want to use it anymore. You can make it move faster by trucks. I don't think so. Not when you try to drive from here to Portland on a Thursday afternoon in the truck traffic. It looks like a railway system and feels like that. And yet I go on trips in the summertime, and the only rail trains that I see are tanker cars. They might be 300 to 1,000 of them, 3 miles long, 5 miles long. That's all that's there is black tanker cars. Where's all of the goods and products? The shipping containers that could be being moved to get around the things that people need, the vaccines for one thing, food, all those things. There's just questions about where does stuff come from? What do we do in order to get it? What does it take from the land that surrounds us? And lots to think about. I brought a new book. Oh, go ahead, Kathy.
You said that the key word there that I was just thinking about, which was stuff. And the fact that we all have too much stuff.
Yes.
And I just put it in chat. I mean, I don't want to leave us feeling hopeless. I think there's things we all can do. And I do believe it starts at home. And I just put a link to a book in there called Zero Waste Home, which is a great place to start in thinking about what do you buy? What containers does it come in? I mean, I absolutely refuse to buy things that come in plastic containers anymore. If it doesn't come in some other option that's recyclable, I don't buy it. It's, you know, I buy a lot of stuff in glass because it's, you know, we can recycle glass, but there's, yeah, I've gotten a lot more thoughtful about what I buy. And there's actually a Facebook group that I joined that's been really helpful in helping me identify environmentally friendly products and alternatives that aren't necessarily always obvious here on store shelves. But I have actually gone to Fred Meyer and asked them to stock certain things, and they've actually started stocking a couple of them. One of them is laundry detergent that does not come in a plastic bottle. It's laundry detergent that comes in little sheets that you just tear off and you throw it in the washer, and it comes in a paper envelope. And when you're done, when it's empty, all you have left behind is a paper envelope that can be recycled. And we're all going to have to get a lot more thoughtful. And it's knowing how commerce works. We have to put pressure on the people who make stuff to make it in an environmentally friendly way and sell it in environmentally friendly containers. And, you know, if we refuse to buy things that aren't that way, guess what? They'll start making it that way. They really don't want to, you know, they don't want to lose their market edge. And so if being more environmentally safe gives them a market edge, they'll do it. But we as consumers have to demand that.
One of my granddaughters, when she was very young, she saw I believe it's a Disney movie called Happy Feet. And it's about these penguins and all different kinds of penguins that love to dance. And in there, one of the penguins was played by Robin Williams. And he played an emperor penguin. And his neck was stuck in the ring of a plastic soda pop carrier.
Yeah.
And it was choking him. He was dying from it. Since that, I've seen that movie. I've noticed that myself, but it affected my granddaughter so much that she went and bought a pair of scissors, little small scissors, for everybody in her family out of her Christmas gift money that she got. And she wrapped them all up and she sent them to everybody with one of those plastic holders in it. And it would have several of them rings cut. And she said, if you ever want to give me a Christmas present or a birthday present, this is what I want you to give me. Is all of these rings cut up with the little scissors that I just gave you. And that will make me the happiest present that I could ever get, because those little emperor penguins won't have them around their throat choking them to death. I've never forgotten that. And to this day, she does that. And I still have my little pair of scissors that are right beside where those plastic ring keepers. You know, there's a ring keeper now that for soda pop and beer and that kind of stuff that is biodegradable. It breaks down and can actually be eaten by fish or in anything that's in the water. It breaks down in the water and becomes a food. Now that's thinking about what you can do to lessen the impacts.
Absolutely. And they're not made out of plastic. They're made out of algae.
Yes.
They're made out of a byproduct made by algae. Yes, we need more of that.
Yes, we do. How's our time? How are we doing here?
Got about 15 minutes, and I just put the title of your book in.
Okay, I brought a book too. This is called Touch the Earth.
Let's see here.
And it has sayings and stories and quotes from different tribal people from across the nation. And it really kind of illuminates the very ancient concepts of stewardship and relationship and connection to place on the land and what it means to people. And it's in the Indian people's own words, and recognizing who that person was and the tribe that they belonged to. I like to give credit to those people that have taught me, my teachers. And this book was one of the very first ones that I started reading, about that illustrated the relationship of reciprocity and of stewardship. And it came to be one of the things that I read that really influenced my life in wanting to teach about these things for many years, and about Native people's relationship to the land and what it means to us and what it means for all people. When we see the advent of war happening and looming in front of us again today, and the destruction that that brings, there's going to be another crisis in the world. There already is with $6 a gallon oil. Why has oil prices gone up when we just started this war? Who's making money off of this war? Here we are threatening to have a world war on top of a world epidemic, a pandemic. How weak do we have to be and become to be eliminated? Mother Earth will only take so much. She has her ways, and she's going to let us know one of these days that she's unhappy with us. It's already happening. We can't get a drop of water right here in Southern Oregon, and yet they're flooding on the East Coast, still having major snowstorms, shutting things down. Colorado just had a massive one yesterday. We are definitely out of balance. And I think it begins with us as human beings to help right the balance and create a future to the seventh generation and beyond, in relationship and recognition of the seven behind the seven beyond that. And you look at what people might have observed and learned over time from all peoples in the way of stewardship and reciprocity and compassion.
Yeah, I agree. And compassion is a great word to remember, because we often think of compassion as only being for other people. We need to have compassion for all living things. I like Robin's words in Braiding Sweetgrass about treating all living things as people, with the same respect that they would treat people.
Yes.
If we did, we would be treating the world a lot differently.
Yes. She'd be a lot more happy with us.
Yes. I think we would be feeling the love of the earth back to us.
So, might be hearing that voice coming from the forest saying, thank you.
I wanted to see if we have any questions or comments from the audience as we're nearing the end of our time together today. If you do, please go ahead and unmute yourself if you'd like. Or you may also raise your hand if you'd like. We also wanted to talk about, just to kind of wrap up, what we can do ourselves individually as we go from here. So Kathy, you mentioned laying in the woods and looking or laying on the forest floor and looking up at the trees, and we've been talking about taking time to reflect. So starting with connecting ourselves to nature. I used to love to go sledding and just go up and down these hills. But then after I'd get really tired, I'd stop at the bottom of the hill and I would lay there on my sled, just looking up. And it's such a quiet place to be in a forest in the snow. It's so beautiful. So I encourage each of you to regularly turn off your electronics, leave them behind. Even when you're walking, I also say this on campus, when you're walking on campus from building to building, like at Redwood, we put your phone away, be looking up, be smiling at each other, greeting each other, and smiling at our one-leggeds, at our cousins. That's really important.
I think so too.
We are so blessed to have walking trails in the woods at the Redwood campus. So if you're on that campus, the Ruckman Trail is a real gift and a great thing to be able to just step out and step into the woods very quickly.
Yes.
I see in the comments, Susan is new here, wondering about honoring the land of the Rogue Community College sits on, and those are conversations that are being had currently about how we can get guidance from our elders and learn how to do it properly, and to so anybody who's interested in that, Susan, I know where your office is, and we can definitely get people involved with this. Also,
COVID, we had a pretty active group that did Earth Day activities in the spring, and I don't know what the plan is for this year, but I'll certainly look into that and see if we're going to do anything this year. I think we're all ready to do some things together.
for sure.
Yep.
So
Be up for that.
I know that the clubs committee and the Associated Student Governments are going to be having that discussion. There is an ICC meeting tomorrow on Zoom at, I believe, at noon. It is in the RCC app for anybody who wants that information. But I do believe that is one of the topics on the agenda is Earth Day. And we also do, during the student government meetings, take a moment of silence to honor the Indigenous people whose land RCC's campus is built on.
Thank you, Danielle. I was looking at our notes. We have grow something we can do to honor the earth, know where our food comes from, and even if it's planting just a container garden, by growing things helps us be connected and helps us give back to the land as well.
One thing that you could do here locally too is don't cut down milkweed. Milkweed is the plant that monarch butterflies are transformed with. The caterpillar lives on the milkweed plant and eats it, incorporates it, becomes the butterfly. The butterfly then carries the pollen from plant to plant and reproduces their own food, assists in the reproduction of their own food. My tribe did this, and we're based in Shawnee, Oklahoma. We were removed there in the 1800s. And we didn't realize it, but our tribal lands that we care for are right smack dab in the middle of the monarch butterfly migratory route, the ones that go deep into California and Central America. And so the tribe on one of the open pieces of ground that we had undertook a planting of milkweed. And they didn't do it in rows, they did it indiscriminate pattern. They just took the seeds and moved them around. And now that pasture is clear full of butterflies every year, and join the migration as it's moving south. I used to do a butterfly release with the Asante hospitals, both in Grants Pass and in Medford, and as part of mourning and grieving recognitions. And the gentleman who would always bring the monarchs to be released, I asked him one year, how far are these the guys that go clear to Central America and Mexico? He said, no. He said, these are a different kind of monarch butterfly that we have here in the West. And their migratory route ends about San Francisco. So I always wondered if they got started doing that to go down to San Francisco and listen to the Grateful Dead in the park, but I asked him that, do they rely upon the milkweed plant the same as the ones in the Midwest? And he said, yes. That's one of their main foods and one of their main areas of transformation. So you could plant milkweed or just not chop it down in your yard.
Yeah, another thing is that right now is not a good time to rake and burn leaves. A lot of bees nest or winter underneath the leaves, and the composition of the leaves releases heat, which keeps them from freezing. So you really need to wait until it's much warmer. And the bees have really kind of hatched out and are out moving about before raking leaves. And our bee populations are in serious jeopardy right now. They're a major pollinator around the world. So
Yes,
something else you can.
All right, do we have any other questions or comments? Remind you that we are gathering for our fourth and final event, AIR, on May 27th, and there'll be an invite coming out as well for that. And if you would like to see any of the Diversity Programming Board events, they're on our webpage. And the easiest thing to do is just go to the homepage for RCC and put in diversity events. Christine, I'm going to ask you if you wouldn't mind putting in our web link for us. Christine is our awesome student employee assistant to the Diversity Programming Board. Thanks for being here with us. And thank you, David and Dr. Kathy Kemp. Appreciate you very much. Hope everybody has a fantastic day.
Yes, me too.
Stargaze and look up at the trees. Be well.
Don't forget to tell those that you love them before the end of each day. We're not guaranteed tomorrow. Take the time.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Sorry, I can't give you a hug.
That's okay.
Giving
Rain
you
check.
a virtual hug.
Virtual
Sally will
hug,
give it-
rain check. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you. You